For 200 years before any of this happened, Europe was thriving. The medieval warm period, roughly the 10th through the 13th centuries, had handed farmers something rare and precious: reliable warm seasons. Fields that had once been too cold and too wet to cultivate were suddenly productive. Villages expanded, populations climbed. England, France, the Low Countries, Scandinavia, all of them were feeding more mouths than they ever had before. It felt like progress. It felt like permanence. Peasants, who made up about 95% of the population, were working strips of land under the feudal system, tied to the soil they tilled. A lord owned the land, the peasant worked it, gave a portion of the harvest as rent, and kept the rest. In a decent year, for every grain of wheat planted, a farmer could expect to get back 6 or 7. That margin was enough to eat, enough to store, barely enough to survive a rough winter. Life was hard, but it functioned. Bread was the daily anchor. Wheat, barley, oats, these weren't just food, they were civilization itself. Lose them, and everything unravels. By 1300, Europe's population had pushed to somewhere near its absolute ceiling. The land was producing at full stretch, and there was no buffer left, no surplus, no room for error. Any historian looking back at this moment can see it clearly. Europe was one bad season away from catastrophe. That season arrived in 1314. Autumn of 1314 brought something the chronicles described as bizarre weather: torrential rain, flooded fields, drowning livestock. Farmers assumed it would pass. It always passed. They kept seed grain in reserve, watched the skies, and waited for spring. But spring 1315 brought no relief. The rain kept falling. It fell through April, through May, through June. It fell all summer. Temperatures stayed cold. The grain couldn't ripen. Hay and straw couldn't dry. Without dry fodder, livestock began to weaken and die. Without livestock, there were no draft animals to work the fields. Without the fields worked, there was no food. The return that year was devastating. For every 2 grains planted, farmers reaped just 1 back. They would have been better off not planting at all. Yorkshire and Nottingham saw catastrophic flooding. Across the English Channel, the French army under Louis X literally got stuck in the mud trying to march into Flanders. The fields were so waterlogged that they had to retreat, burning their own supplies rather than let them fall into enemy hands. What people didn't know, couldn't have known, was that this wasn't just a bad year. The medieval warm period had ended. A new climate era was beginning, what historians now call the Little Ice Age. Some researchers believe a volcanic eruption, possibly Mount Tarawera in New Zealand around 1314, had already seeded ash into the upper atmosphere, dimming the sun across the northern hemisphere. The weather wasn't misbehaving, it had permanently changed. By winter 1314 into 1315, people quickly understood that something was wrong. They rationed. They held back seed grain, which meant even less flour for bread. Salt, the only reliable preservative for meat, became nearly impossible to produce, because salt extraction through evaporation requires dry air and sun, and there was neither. Its price shot up overnight. A quarter barrel of wheat, which had cost around 5 shillings, jumped to 40 shillings by the height of the famine. A single penny, which once bought a decent loaf, now bought 2 small onions, if you could find even that. Edward II tried to act. In spring 1315, he issued a royal decree capping the prices of basic foodstuffs, essentially an early attempt at price control. The merchants simply refused to sell at those prices. The decree collapsed by the Lincoln Parliament of 1316, abandoned as unenforceable. The machinery of medieval government had no mechanism for a crisis of this scale. There were no granaries to open, no national food reserves, no organized relief. The church tried. The Archbishop of Canterbury eventually sold his holy relics to raise money for food, but selling gold crosses doesn't grow wheat. August 1315 produced one of the most striking images of the entire famine. King Edward II arrived at the Abbey of St Albans with his royal household, expecting the usual lavish hospitality. Lords and abbots always dreaded the king arriving. Feeding a royal entourage was financially ruinous even in good times. But this time, the abbot could barely find enough bread for the king himself. The most powerful man in England could not be properly fed. That single moment tells you everything about how total the collapse was. Throughout 1316, the reign continued. The people it fell on were already weakened, malnourished, exhausted, their immune systems crumbling. Disease moved fast through bodies with nothing left to fight with. Children and the elderly died first and in the greatest numbers. Average life expectancy in England during this period dropped from around 35 years to under 30. In Bristol, the City Chronicles recorded scenes that read like the end of the world. The living could barely keep pace with burying the dead. People were eating horse meat, dog meat. In Northumbria, already being raided and looted by Scottish forces taking advantage of England's weakness, people reportedly ate anything they could find: roots, bark, wild grasses, nuts foraged from frozen forests. The chronicles of the time also record incidents of cannibalism. Graves were reportedly opened. Parents, according to some accounts, abandoned children in the forests, a reality so common it embedded itself into the folk memory of Europe, resurfacing centuries later as the story of Hansel and Gretel. Older people voluntarily stopped eating so younger family members could survive and continue working the land. These weren't dramatic choices, they were quiet, desperate, ordinary. Then, as if the failed harvests weren't enough, cattle plague arrived. Starting around 1318, a murrain swept through English and European livestock populations with savage efficiency. Cattle and sheep, already depleted because desperate families had been slaughtering them for food since 1315, died in waves. Some regions lost up to 80% of their herds. These animals weren't just food, they were the engines of agriculture. Lose your oxen and you cannot plough. Lose your sheep and you lose wool, the economic lifeblood of medieval England. The famine that had started in the sky came down to earth and finished its work in the fields. The weather finally began to normalize in the summer of 1317. Harvests improved modestly. But improvement isn't recovery. Seed stocks were devastated. Herds were shattered. The peasantry was physically broken, underfed for 3 consecutive years, riddled with disease, their tools worn out, their draft animals dead. It took until 1322 for the food supply to stabilize, and the economy didn't return to pre-famine levels until the eve of the next catastrophe, the Black Death, in 1348. What came after the famine was in some ways as transformative as the famine itself. The feudal structure, the arrangement where lords provided protection and peasants provided labour, had been exposed as fundamentally hollow. When the fields failed, lords had nothing to offer. Many peasants starved on land they had worked for generations and received nothing in return. The survivors noticed. Those who lived through the famine emerged with a different sense of their own value. They began demanding higher wages, pushing back against obligations. Crime rose sharply during and immediately after the famine years. Land that had once been competed for was left vacant because there weren't enough people to work it. This shift in power, subtle at first, then accelerating, would eventually contribute to the breakdown of serfdom across England and Europe. The peasants who survived 1315 didn't lead a revolution overnight, but the ground underneath the feudal order had shifted. The peasants' revolt of 1381, decades later, drew on a resentment that had roots in this period. And then came 1348. The Great Famine had killed somewhere between 10 and 25% of the population in the worst affected regions of Northern Europe, millions of people. It had stunted the survivors, it had destroyed the livestock base and the agricultural infrastructure, and a population already weakened by decades of poor nutrition was exactly the population least equipped to survive the arrival of the bubonic plague. The Black Death killed between 45 and 62% of England's population. Historians now see the Great Famine not as a standalone disaster, but as the opening act, the event that softened Europe up for what came next. The 14th century is sometimes called the calamitous century. That name wasn't invented by academics sitting comfortably in libraries. It was earned in the mud and rain of 1315, in the empty grain stores of 1316, in the silent fields of 1317, and in everything those years set in motion. Before the rains came, people worked land they believed would always yield. During the famine, they worked the same land with their last strength, eating their seed, burying their neighbors, and wondering what they had done to deserve it. After it ended, those who were left looked at the world differently because they had watched a system fail them completely and had survived anyway. The Great Famine of 1315 didn't just kill people, it ended an era. The long, warm, optimistic medieval summer was over, and Europe, without knowing it yet, was walking into something much colder.